Welcome to The Explainer. You know, if you've ever felt that today's political and cultural divides seem way deeper than just disagreements over policy, well, you are definitely not alone. In this Explainer, we're going to unpack an argument that traces the roots of these conflicts back more than 50 years, from a student activist slogan all the way to the headlines we see today.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to dig into a historical idea called the Long March. Then we'll see where its influence is said to have really taken hold. After that, we'll explore the core philosophies that are supposedly driving all this, check out the real-world consequences some analysts are pointing to, and finally, we'll wrap up by asking what this all means for the very divided world we live in.
All right, let's start with a phrase that you might have heard floating around lately. But believe it or not, it actually comes from the student movements way back in the 1960s.
So, this term, the Long March Through the Institutions, was apparently coined by an activist named Rudy Dushki. And the idea? It was simple, but really powerful. If you want radical change, don't just stand outside and protest. No, instead, you become part of the system. We're talking government, media, education, and you transform it from the inside out. Now, the philosopher Herbert Marcuse was a huge fan of this idea. He even called it the only effective way. And as you can see in this quote, he's basically describing a strategy of working within an institution, all while secretly working against it. The ultimate goal was to build a totally new counter-institution right from the inside.
So the big question is, where did this march supposedly happen? Well, according to the analysis from a recent symposium at the New College of Florida, the main battleground, the ground zero for all this, has been the university system.
The symposium, held right here, brought together a bunch of scholars who argue that universities are the perfect incubator for a strategy like this. Why? Because that's where our future leaders, our thinkers, and our professionals are all shaped.
So a central claim that came out of the symposium is that the whole ideological makeup of university faculty has changed, and not just a little, but dramatically. The argument isn't just that academia leans left, which, it often has. The argument is that it's become overwhelmingly dominated by one side of the political spectrum. And here's the data they used to back that up. Check this out. In 1969, the ratio of left-leaning to right-leaning faculty was less than 2 to 1. Not that huge of a gap. But by 2019, that ratio had skyrocketed to 5 to 1. This massive shift is presented as the key piece of evidence for their entire argument.
So, what is driving this shift? Well, the sources we're looking at argue it's not just about party politics. It goes way deeper. It's about a fundamental clash between two completely different ways of seeing the world.
At the heart of this whole divide, these analyses suggest, are two big competing ideas. One that sees all of society as a power struggle between groups, and another that really emphasizes individual rights and universal rules for everybody. So one of the core concepts, as defined by sources like the Institute of Public Affairs, is what they call identity politics. They argue that this worldview basically frames society as a constant conflict between groups, which gets sorted into these neat little categories of oppressed and privileged. And this really brings us to a fundamental clash of ideals. On one side, you have the view that the government should be actively managing outcomes for different groups to correct for historical wrongs. And on the other side, you have the principle of formal equality, which is the idea that the law should be blind to group identity and apply the exact same rules to everyone. Now, there's another concept highlighted in an analysis from the Brussels Signal called oikophobia. Oikos is actually Greek for home, so this term describes an aversion to your own home, your country, your culture, your heritage, and viewing it as something shameful, something that you need to atone for.
So the argument goes that these aren't just dusty old academic theories. The next step is to see how they supposedly play out in the real world, beyond the walls of the university campus.
And that's a fair question, right? Do these ideas actually have an impact outside of a classroom? Well, the sources we've looked at argue yes, absolutely. They claim these ideas influence everything from street protests all the way to corporate HR policies.
For instance, a commentary in the Hub Canada makes the case that these ideas can actually be used to justify political violence. And their analysis of the logic goes like this. If you see politics only as a struggle between an oppressor and the oppressed, well then violence can pretty easily be framed as a legitimate tool for liberation.
So let's drill down on this. The sources point to a few specific consequences. They describe a political landscape that's been totally reframed as a power struggle, which they say then leads to a belief in a right to resist, sometimes violently. They also point to alliances that might seem
Well, pretty strange on the surface, like the Queers for Palestine movement, but they argue that from this worldview it makes perfect sense as a shared anti-establishment project.
So when you pull all these different threads together, the argument from these analyses is that our divisions aren't just about things like taxes or healthcare. No, they're about a fundamental conflict over our vision for society itself.
And this quote from the Brussels Signal really frames the entire conflict as something much, much bigger. They argue it's not just a culture war. It's basically a referendum on the value of Western civilization itself. Is it something that should be defended, or should it be dismantled?
And all of this leaves us with a really provocative final question. If two sides see the world from completely opposite starting points, with different views on history, justice, and even truth, how can they ever find common ground? I mean, how do you even have a conversation when you don't speak the same language? That right there is the challenge at the very heart of the Great Divide.